Hi, everybody. Been a hot minute with Tim Cain. We have been jumping back into development here, and we had some extra time. So this is Tim Cain talking about player hoarding. Who is guilty of player hoarding? Is this about players not using their damn potions? That's one of them. That's one of them. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard to tell players that they need to use things, but then also give them things to use. I don't know. It's like, here's the thing. So before we even get into the video, if you put like some super useful potion before a boss room, I think that players by and large will figure out, oh, use this potion for this thing. But then you find, I don't know, random chest out in the open world, right? Has a potion of resist magic or something like that. A lot of players will just hoard it, throw it in like their chest because it weighs stuff, and then when they go and find the boss that needs it, nobody wants to take time out of fighting a boss to go back to their chest, pull out the potions, and then come back. Like, well, I'm just going to try to beat it a few times without it, and then you do that for like 2 hours, knowing that you could have spent 20 minutes going and grabbing the potions and coming back and beating it in one try. I don't know, it's hard. It's just kind of, you don't want to use useful things because you might need useful things for other use cases, but then by the time the game ends, you realize that there's no more use cases left, and now you have tons of shit in your pack. I don't know. It is what it is. I don't know how you can. Well, let's see what Tim says about it. Let's see if he has any good ideas and recommendations.
Hi everyone, it's me, Tim,
Hi, Tim.
and today I want to talk about
Been a while.
player hoarding.
Yeah.
Mr. Awesome 5211 asks, what suggestions would you have regarding player hoarding when it comes to items and skills throughout the game? That's a good question. And I know, everyone's had the experience where they end a game and they have 1,000 heal potions, or that one scroll of doom that you were waiting for just the right moment to
Yeah,
use.
like that insta kill. I think didn't Divinity Original Sin. What game had the arrow where you could instantly kill an enemy? Like most enemies. I think it was Divinity. I know I finished the game, or whatever game had that. I know I finished that game without using that thing because I didn't know when it would be best to use it. Maybe it was Dragon's Dogma.
Or you had a heal entire party spell that you never cast
Yep.
because you never came across a point where everyone in the party was hurt. Everybody hoards. Every game I think I've ever played, I've hoarded something, and there are some people who just can't stop hoarding. It's what they do, and some of those people even like hoarding. I don't think all of them do. I think some people hoard and they wish they didn't, but they hoard anyway. But I think what we can do is look at game design to encourage players not to do that. And I think we got to look at two different things.
Yeah, it is a
You
game
talk
design
about
problem.
items and skills, and I'm going to assume for skills you meant hoarding as in not using them because they had a limit on how often you could use them.
I'm thinking more like maybe skill points, but yeah, I think skills. I don't know what is meant by the question, but items is a very tangible, commonplace thing to hoard in pretty much any RPG game where you have a lot, right? I think that maybe some of it comes down to good itemization. So if you make it really easy to organize, filter, sell items, you might encourage players to keep, to do that as part of their loop. Or if, I don't know, breaking down old weapons and armor gives you components, and you balance the economy in a way that you're probably going to need that constant influx of components to craft things and to, repair or whatever. You can probably get players into the mindset that this is part of the loop, is to use things, to remove things, to keep your inventory relatively clutter free. The problem still comes down to if you have any sort of player chest and you give player the freedom to roam around, the game design is inevitably going to have to encourage the player to have enough options at any point where they don't feel like they're funneled into one part of the content. What I mean by that is that if you make it so the player has to do the main quest in order to get enough materials to do the side quests, then you don't have really this like free open world. You have this linear game that you have to engage in order to engage with the side content. most players don't like that, especially in these open world free RPGs. Imagine if in Skyrim you had to, well, you kind of do, but imagine if it was even worse that you had to complete the main quest, go talk to the fucking graybeards, and learn the voice stuff in order to actually progress through the side content. You really only have to do that until you get the whirlwind shout, right, to move forward. And even then, it's not like a requirement to do the side content. It just helps. Imagine that was worse. I think that a lot of players would hate it. They would feel like they can't engage in the content at their own pace and in the way that they want to. They can't just walk in a random direction and be able to enjoy the game. They have to walk in a certain direction in order to walk in other directions. So inevitably, you're going to run into the issue if you do that, where you will have to place these randomized items or include enough materials and items to encourage the player to keep going forward in the direction that they want to go in. And so the player is probably going to end up with a massive stockpile of things that they aren't going to use, aren't going to need, and it just isn't worth the time and effort to sell them, especially to merchants that only have limited gold, only buy certain things, are only available in certain regions of the world, only available at certain times of the day. Insert restriction, restriction, restriction. It's easier for the player to just either not pick it up, to pick it up and store it, and then probably never sell it because that's a waste of time. I don't know how you resolve that. I really don't. But we'll see. We'll see what Tim says.
So you saved it until a perfect moment. So let's talk about items first, because I think that's easier to comprehend and easier to talk about, and happens in every game. I think games that drop things that are usable make people want to wait for the perfect time to use them.
Yes, but how do you know when it's the perfect time? That's the problem. I think that's the thing that you can artificially make it, right? You can make an enemy that is 99% resistant to every form of damage except for one. And then make it so that you can, inscribe your weapon or something with a certain element for the thing that it's weak to. Okay, therefore, you have now encouraged the player to use the item that they probably need to use and they have to use in order to kill this thing with any sort of reason. However, now again, you funneled the player into one way of playing. And if you have a game where you have 10 different ways of playing, 10 different ways of solving this boss, magic, ranged, melee combat, different types of these things, whatever, bombs, explosives, consumables, you will inevitably have to give the player all of these things throughout their gameplay in order to resolve the problem. So even there's just no way to avoid the hoarding or to avoid presenting the player with the opportunity to hoard. Maybe that's the better way to put it, where yes, I'm a melee class, but I see arrows in a chest. You are presenting me with the opportunity to hoard. And it feels bad to leave valuable things behind. Maybe they're really good arrows, but they weigh a lot, but it's like, okay, well, I could sell them, but now I feel horrible for leaving them behind. That's not a great feeling that you want to put in the player, right? Realistically, you want to show them things that they can use. Some games do this, by the way. Now that I think about it, some games will show you or drop you items that are only usable by your class. So if you play a melee character, you're only going to find melee gear. I'm not a big fan of this solution, especially in games. I know that I don't remember what game it is, but I think there are a few examples where you can create multiple characters and have a shared stash. So when it drops items that's only usable for your current character, you actually make it worse to play other characters, because now you would need to do the same thing with those characters instead of balancing them out, giving them that head start from your previous playtime. It's such a problem. I don't know.
I've mentioned this before, but Breath of the Wild solved this issue.
Oh, did they?
By their weapons.
Oh yeah, they have uses.
Decayed.
Yes. Yep.
With use.
You're right.
And eventually break. And then you just had to use another one. This is a way that forced you to just keep getting more weapons and be glad you got more weapons and lose the ones that broke.
I will say it is a solution. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is a good solution. but it is a solution. Ironically, that was the top complaint about that game. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I'm trying to say. That you worded it better. Is that yeah, okay. Now everything every weapon the player picks up is going to be useful if we want to use that definition of the word useful. I just don't think players like to min max. They like to find the weapons and the way of playing that they enjoy. Love it or hate it, Stealth Archer in Skyrim is really fun to play. It's fun and it's easy, and so a lot of players choose it. So if you don't allow the player to min max in that regard and make the best Daedric bow possible and poison their arrows and stuff like that to go even crazier with it, I don't know, players might not find an incentive to upgrade their character, right? You've essentially removed a big path of progression in an open world RPG. I don't know if the way that Zelda handled it is the best, but I mean, it is a solution.
A lot of games have encumbrance. Most of my games use this. There's a reason for encumbrance. It makes the player drop things.
Yeah, you have
it
to make
makes
that
them
choice.
keep what they think is usable and throw out the rest.
It's a friction point, right? It's a point of friction where you have to choose what you need to take and what you need to optimize with your setup. And I think that is probably the a good middle ground, right? I think that most players can accept that in a game that allows you to play the way you want, you're inevitably going to run across things that you don't need or don't want. And it's okay to leave them behind. The issue, I think, is when the economy forces you to pick up things to sell, and that can encourage players to kind of always have maximum encumbrance because they're kind of toting something, have to take it back to town, sell it, but they don't want to have to do that too often, right? You don't want to have to go visit one place, loot, come back, sell, stash, go out, visit one place, come back, loot, sell to seller or store. You want to have maybe a number of places as a designer that the player can visit before they need to perform that part of the loop. So maybe every 2 to 3 locations, every 2 in-game hours roughly, that's going to be, the player will likely have to come back and store or sell some things. That's all part of the balance, all part of the pacing, and messing that up can ruin the feeling of hoarding or picking things up too. A lot of things like regarding encumbrance, the player hoarding things, it all comes down to like just the balance of how you encourage encounters and how you want to reinforce parts of the economical loop of the game, right?
A lot of people don't like encumbrance. They find it too restrictive. But every time we've experimented with the idea of getting rid of encumbrance, we just shift the problem to another part of the game, which is inventory. If people can get a lot of things, they then complain that they have a lot of things and that they can't get through their inventory. So then we try to make tabs with an inventory for all the different types of things. But inevitably, the things in one of those tabs, one or more, will fill up, and then they complain about all the things under my junk tab or all the things under my consumables tab.
Mm-hmm.
So you still end up having a problem, and I think encumbrance helps solve that, as much as some people don't like it. But some other ideas would be to make it, you're trying to solve the problem of people have something that they don't feel like they should use. You could make it so instead of it's things you pick up, here's an item that has charges, and the charges somehow get restored. For example, let's say instead of picking up heal potions, you just have a magic flask that when you dip in a magic fountain, fills up with 5 charges of heal. You can always go back to that fountain and fill it back up.
A lot of ARPG games are doing this nowadays. I don't know how I feel about it. I don't know how I feel. Maybe I'm old school in that way, but I like having individual items for health potions, and I don't like the whole charge mechanic. I don't know. I think it's kind of one of those individual likes or dislikes.
This lets the designer place these fountains at regular enough intervals that people feel like they don't have to run too far to get to a fountain. But in the middle of combat, you probably can't run off to the fountain. In some boss combats, maybe gates or something prevent you from even leaving the arena. So there's no hoarding in the sense of you don't feel like you have to save those heal potions for a particular combat.
I mean, it's better for balancing, right? Where you know that you need to balance this encounter around the fact that every player is only going to be able to heal themselves to full health 5 times. That makes it so much easier to balance and debug and things like that. However, I don't like it because to me it feels artificial when I see this like restore health pots before you enter this boss arena. It's like, why can't I be over prepared? Why can that not be something that is kind of encouraged by the game or allows me to get through things? If the only way that you're balancing an encounter is through this DPS race between you and a boss, maybe the game combat is kind of not really balanced very well. I think cooldowns on health potions works a little bit better. It doesn't have to be significant, but something, or just the rate at which you heal is much better outside of combat, but once you're inside of combat, you may need to, play it a bit safer. I don't know what it is. I think either can work, but it's just up to preference.
But once that combat starts, you know you only have no more than, say, 3 or 5 charges.
Yeah.
It also is easier for the designer than to design a combat, knowing that there's a limit on how many of these things will be available.
Exactly.
I think other ways you can do this, which factor into other game mechanics people want to do, is maybe your magic heal flasks completely refills when you sleep. But sleeping costs time and money. So time passes, and there's a certain amount of money involved in sleeping. Either you have to rent a room or a bed,
supplies or something. Yeah,
camping supplies.
That's what I was thinking of. Is like kind of like D&D mechanics right now, where you rest, you use supplies, and then you gain your charges back for your spell slots or something. Or that's how you heal, because then your spells to heal cost spell slots, and the potions to heal are very limited, so you want to save those. So yeah, I think that works really well too.
Games. The idea is sleeping is a time and money sink, which is really important for many games to have both of those. So you often find yourself going, well, I still have a couple charges left on this. I keep going, rather than have that time and money sink happen. And then lastly, and you've seen this in other games, found items can go into special places. Maybe if it's junk, it just goes into a junk bag. That doesn't count against your encumbrance, and when you go to town, it automatically gets sold. So you can think of junk items as money. They're effectively found money.
They're immersive money. And I don't necessarily hate it, although I think it's I think it's a lot of work to make items like that for not much gain from the player's value. I don't know about you, or about you guys in chat. I'm not the biggest fan of just picking up items in a game only to realize that they're junk and that the only use they have is to weigh me down and to make a little bit of money. I'd rather just be given money. I mean, it's great that games have like flavor items and that some of these might not have any use to me. I don't know. I've never been a huge fan of it. I get it, but in the background, the goal is to give the player this more immersive way to obtain money over time through junk items. And it's just kind of eh.
If you played Pillars, we had something called a stash. And the stash was something that you could put things into it, but you could only take out the last thing you put in. The idea for a stash, and that way you had to play if you wanted to get into it. The idea for a stash was throw things in the stash, don't worry about the stash. When you get to town, you can review what's in your stash, sell what's in your stash. This lets people leave nothing behind, but they have to review it later. It's like kind of gone, or it's not really something for them to use as an active inventory. So these are a lot of ways you can deal with items. So let's talk a little bit about skills. there's always going to be that problem where you give someone a really powerful, like you have a big fireball or a death spell or
Mm-hmm.
a heal everybody spell, and you feel like, well, I don't want to use this unless I'm being attacked by something powerful or a lot of things, or everybody in the party's hurt. That makes sense. Otherwise, I'll do individual heals. There's a lot of ways you can get around feeling like people need to hoard those uses of their skills. For example, you may have a skill set up so that there's a lot of free ones that do a small amount of damage that build up to the use of a big one. You see this in a lot of games. Um, a lot of melee attacks that build up to a big finish,
Yeah.
or the way we did monks. They do their little attacks, they let themselves get hurt, they build up those wounds, and then they power their big attacks with the wounds. Those are ways of telling players, you have these big abilities, but you're going to have to wait to use them. But when you can use them, you might as well use them because you're still building up to use them again. So you almost want to use them so that you can start rebuilding a second use. So you can use them 2, 3, 4 times in a combat.
I think some of this depends on genre, where, if you have like a game like World of Warcraft or something, some big MMO where you have a whole keyboard of skills in order to use, there's going to be some optimizations that get done. I'm not a big fan of those types of games personally. I would rather have, that selection of like 3 to 5 powerful skills, usually like maybe 5 to 10, let's say, right? So I can bind them to number keys realistically. I'm probably only going to end up using 5 of those at any point. That to me feels okay. So I don't know if players save up their powerful skills as much as they need to optimize their damage output for what they're fighting. So against rabble, just a bunch of like riffraff that you fight every so often, you can just spam your ultimate, kill them in one hit, and by the time you hit the next group, it'll probably have cooled down so you can use it again. But in like a boss fight, you may want to save that for a specific moment. And I think then you can lean into using having like skills with mechanics on them. Sorry. That was pretty dry. You can use like skills with mechanics on them. So maybe if enemy is staggered, this does more damage, right? Or it, opens up a, like a weak point or something. So I think there are more interesting ways to do boss fights than simply skill does damage, save your highest damage skill for, I don't know, whenever, or wait till it cools down. I don't know. This whole skill, like for player hoarding with skills, I don't really think is as great of a discussion as like with items.
You can also have spells that use mana. And therefore you don't hoard individual spells. Yeah, now people kind of hoard mana,
Yeah.
but you could have a mana potion with charges like that heal potion. So they don't think of mana as something that they always have to conserve super carefully because it can be renewed to a limit. And that way designers can still plan for this is how many times you can renew mana in one particular combat. Pillars use something that I really liked, which was refreshing skills and spells during combat. There were skills you could use frequently. You'd use them and then they'd cool down and you could use them again.
Yeah, your spam
There were
skills.
skills that refreshed after every combat.
Mm-hmm.
So you had this skill and you knew you could only use it once, but you got to use it in this combat. So you probably did use it every combat.
Yeah, we did that with Darkest Dungeon as well. And I leaned pretty heavily into using things like that for like buffing skills. So initially, the way that Darkest Dungeon was designed was that you could stack buffing skills, but they have a lifetime for like 3 rounds. So you could spend 2 to 3 rounds buffing up a character more and more, and it's stacked additively. What I did was I either kept the power of that buff the same, or I would increase it a bit, but I would make it use limit like 1 or 2 per battle. So you could, use it at like the start of the battle to buff your unit, and then it just stayed buffed for the entire battle, and you could use that character to do something else. So it didn't feel like you were only fighting with 3 characters because you had to use one to buff another character the whole time. You just spent 1 round buffing, and then you could play through that round with the buff, and that seemed to be more enjoyable. And then you could lengthen combat scenarios with that, and it didn't feel like the player was, wasting turns buffing characters over and over again. I like that. I think that works really well in certain types of games, especially turn-based games.
That. Then there are ones that refreshed every day or
Hmm.
every sleep period.
We could do that too in Darkest Dungeon, which I liked. There were ones where it was limit like per dungeon, which is pretty cool. I think we mostly use that for camping skills though in some cases. I didn't use that for like combat skills too much.
Again, the sleep period here can cost time and money. So this
Hmm.
stuff works if the designer is thinking of what the money sink and time sink is going to cost the player.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot more you can do. In fact, what I do is I encourage designers and anybody working on the game to brainstorm methods that make sense for your game, that exist in mechanics that encourage the use of these abilities. And that's something that I kind of want to say that's kind of the moral of this entire talk. When you're designing, many people feel like they need to design against a behavior. Like people are hoarding. How can I stop them? The real question is, why aren't they using?
Yeah, you should be asking how can I positively reinforce the use of items, not how should I stop the player from hoarding items, right? Because you should be trying to solve pain points, but not necessarily solving all friction points. When the player has to make a tough choice, that is a friction point. But, a tough choice in a game like, let's say, Mass Effect, right? If you're choosing, some big character moment, that's good friction. That's that tough choice that the player is thinking about when the player has to think, okay, I can choose between this really good reward or this really good reward in a quest. Again, that's a good friction point. That's a good choice that the player has to make. The pain point for a game where you have a lot of lootable items is where you have maybe bad balance with the weight of items, and the player feels bad having to leave so much behind when they know that they could take it all back with them to sell and make a good amount of money. Maybe you just drop fewer items, reduce the weight, reduce the value of these items so that the player can hoard a bit more and feel like they can explore and not have to go get too crazy with choosing what to pick up or not to pick up. I think that generally Fallout and Skyrim do a pretty good job at this, right? Fallout and Elder Scrolls, where some things can be pretty heavy, especially in like Fallout. You get some of like the junk items that are really heavy, but the player isn't in a horrible position where they can pick things up and they can always offload onto their companion, which is kind of that backup inventory. And you know that at the point you're doing that, okay, I need to be a little bit careful. I can maybe go to one or two more places and loot them before I have to go back and sell things or store things. So it all comes down to balance, is what I would say. And you, like Tim says, you don't need to take a look at everything that makes the player feel friction and solve it, because friction can be good. What you should try to resolve is negative amounts of frustration. Some frustration is friction, some frustration, therefore, is good. Too much frustration leads to not feeling rewarded, not feeling good about having to engage with the content. That can be where a boss fight is just so poorly balanced that at a certain point it becomes unfun to play against that boss. You've seen everything it has to offer, you're doing your best, it's now not fun. That's at a point where you now have a pain point, and that should try to be resolved.
You want to design to encourage a behavior. If you want players to use abilities, give them a reason they want to use it. And that's counter to that overriding reason of I better save it for a better time. If it's an ability that you get to use in every combat, they're great. They're probably using it in every combat, especially near the end of a combat. They're like, oh, there's one guy left.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do the big damage spell against him. The faster I get him down, the better.
Or even, to kill off the big guys at the start or something. Yeah, I think that not only with skills, but with items, a good way to reinforce it is to let the player become powerful. Look at a game like Divinity Original Sin. Divinity is a game that is very easy to beat if you min-max. It is a game that heavily rewards item usage by making you a fucking god. And it feels good. Those games are very highly reviewed for that reason. So, if you want to make item usage good and encourage item usage, don't make it so that you get like a 5% buff or a 10% buff. Go all in. Go all in. Make it a 25% damage boost, a 50% damage boost, but make it, rare to find these items. Now you have a bit more of like, okay, this is really going to power me up. I'm going to use it, right? It doesn't have to be so rare that you never find them, but make them so that, okay, I know how I can get these. I know how I can make these. I'm going to use one here because it will for sure help me get through this difficult content. As opposed to, well, it kind of gives me a little bit of an edge, but I don't want to use it because, they're pretty rare, whatever, hard to come by. I can maybe use this in another scenario. Credits roll, player never used any of them.
If you have a spell that's usable once a day and you have an encounter when going back to town, you might as well use that spell because you're about to go into town and reset all your abilities. So that's what I've always encouraged designers to think about. There's a strong desire to thwart players, but that comes across in your game and in your design. What you really want to do is reward somehow, encourage somehow a player to play the game the way that you want them to.
Yeah.
And then they'll play that way because it's in their best interest, but you've designed for it to be played that way, so you enjoy them doing that. It's kind of, I know that feels a little backwards that, hey, shouldn't I just make the game out there and let people play how they want? Yeah, you should always let people play how they want. But if there's a certain way you want them to play, rewarding them to play that way is very good. It's what I used to say about evil players. You can be evil, but the game will have reactions against that. And you're going to have to live with it. That was your choice. And you shouldn't be surprised that, you slaughter everybody in one town and then people in the next town don't like you. So
to me,
always design towards encouraging the behaviors from the players you want, and then you can get the results you want. So encourage people to use their items and use their spells and skills, and they'll do so, and they won't feel like they're being railroaded, but they also will feel like, hey, I got to use those things and I'm going to get to use them again, and
it's a tough balance to strike. It really is. And the more freedom that you want the player to have in the way that they play, the more you're going to end up with a scenario where it's probably pretty easy to beat the game in that way. I think that there are some easy solutions, right? With like balancing enemy health, enemy damage, player damage, the amount of loot you find. That can always help to augment players who are really good at min-maxing. They feel more comfortable. Maybe they played the game before already and they know some of the tips and tricks. But inevitably, if you want to go for that, high amount of freedom, you're going to have to enable that freedom versus railroading the player and carefully crafting the amount of gear and stuff that they obtain, right? So like, just take a linear game like, I don't know, Uncharted or something, right? You can very carefully determine when the player has access to certain weapons because the game is linear. The player's not going to be able to randomly pick up an RPG at the start of the game, of course. Or the game with a lot of freedom where, yeah, the player might end up going to a tougher location and they can brute force their way through it or sneak through it or something, and then they obtain some really good weapon. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's what the player has chosen to do, but maybe this weapon has ammo that is hard to obtain when you're starting the game, so it's kind of that last resort or boss weapon until you can manageably sustain the ammo usage, which you would do in the later game. So there's lots of points to balance the player and what they have access to, and it is a lot of work. Balancing a game is very hard. It's a lot of work. I love doing it. Not all designers love doing it. In fact, I've met more designers that hate balancing than enjoy it, so it is what it is.
Win-win for everybody. Other than that, I don't really have anything to say about hoarding. Some people love hoarding stuff. I've seen the Skyrim homes that are full of cheese. If that's the way you want to play, more power to you. I just think the game should be designed with encouraging certain kinds of behaviors. So I hope that answers your question, Mr. Awesome 5211.
Yeah, here's the thing. I don't think that players will rate a game worse if they end up hoarding and don't use a lot of the consumables by the end of the game. But I do think that players will consider a game better if they are encouraged to use those items and the game rewards that usage, right? But it's a good talk. It's a good talk, and one that I think doesn't always have a perfect solution. Just depends on the game that you're making. CD encouraged me to become a psychopath killer and a womanizer. Well, I was already those things. Alright guys, if you like this video, here is the link. Go give this a like and give Tim a subscription. He definitely deserves it. And if you're watching on YouTube, hope you enjoyed that one, and I will catch you on the next one. We can do one more today, maybe. Yeah, I think we can do one more. So, watching on YouTube, take care, YouTube. Bye, guys.